So my name's David Swanson. I'm going to try and be brief because I want to have questions and answers, and I hope we can stay beyond our permitted limit. I don't think we need to be quite so obedient as we tend to be. I also, I know departments have names, and we should name them by their names and so forth, but, spending money that creates aggressive wars and makes us all less safe shouldn't be called defensive any more than it has to be. So I'm not going to call it that. And if you ask me questions about the defense spending, I'm going to just give you a strange look and not respond. So let's try to shift this language. I'm also going to skip a bunch of this that's repetitive. I'm sitting here learning a lot in these past two remarks, and I watch this stuff every day. So if you want my full remarks, go to davidswanson.org or october2011.org or warisacrime.org. So back around May or June, a bunch of us announced plans for this coming Thursday, October 6th, to occupy Freedom Plaza in Washington, D.C. Not for a march or a rally and not for a day or a weekend, but to create a central space for an ongoing occupation from which we would engage in nonviolent resistance. We were inspired by the Arab Spring and Wisconsin and working for a U.S. autumn. Now, of course, we are also inspired by the occupation of Wall Street. It has been wonderful to see more and more people and organizations compelled to join in that action, and to see militarism and plutocracy opposed together by a movement that refuses to be dumbed down into a soundbite. Over 150 organizations are part of the planning for Freedom Plaza at october2011.org, and all are encouraged to join in. Wall Street's servants on K Street, in the Pentagon, and in our government may be feeling comfortably distant from Wall Street right about now. But I do not see any reason to support protests of the wealth that corrupts our government and not protests of the government corrupted by that wealth. Choosing to be corrupted is an active choice. Corruption is not something imposed on helpless victims. We chose October 6th because the Afghanistan war was due to go into its second decade. Over 4,000 people have taken this pledge at october2011.org. Quote, I pledge that if any U.S. troops, contractors, or mercenaries remain in Afghanistan on Thursday, October 6th, 2011, as that occupation goes into its 11th year, I will commit to being in Freedom Plaza in Washington, D.C., with others on that day, with the intent of making it our Tahrir Square, Cairo, our Madison, Wisconsin, where we will nonviolently resist the corporate machine to demand that our resources are invested in human needs and environmental protection instead of war and exploitation. We can do this together. We will be the beginning. End quote. I hope that you will go and pledge the same, if you haven't already, at october2011.org. It has been 3 years now since a Russian ambassador to Afghanistan said that the United States had repeated all of the Soviet Union's mistakes in Afghanistan and moved on to new ones. 3 years ago. Mistakes is a common euphemism for crimes and other words that we would be applying were ours the country violently occupied, were ours the bulk of the deaths and the misery, were our doors being kicked in and our loved ones disappeared, were the missiles hitting our homes. Every year, of course, as British Member of Parliament Rory Stewart recently pointed out, top Western officials have claimed that whatever year it was going to be the decisive one. And each year, it has not been. This past week, the United Nations reported an increase in violence in Afghanistan of about 40% over last year. NATO deemed that story inappropriate and announced its own findings the very next day. It turns out that if you believe violence isn't violence when it's committed by the United States and our allies, then you can look at certain types of violence initiated by Afghans and identify a dramatic decrease of, wait for it, 2%. But don't book that Afghan vacation just yet. Migratory birds have been avoiding Afghanistan for some years now. Afghans with higher educations have been leaving for decades. War profiteers and occupation profiteers and so-called reconstruction profiteers seem to know their way out. But imperial rulers, whether British or Soviet or U.S., Nobel Peace Prize winners or otherwise, seem utterly incapable of withdrawing other people's kids from Afghan wars until no other option remains. Why this inability to leave? Why stay? It is not to track down Osama bin Laden on the off chance he wasn't really given that proper Muslim sea burial. It is not to find the number 8 regional leader in al-Qaeda, and certainly not to oppose the Taliban, which feeds off the occupation. It may be for politics, but U.S. opinion polls, as we've just seen, could hardly scream "get out" more clearly. It is almost certainly for profits and pipelines and permanent bases. A U.S. executive, a job creator, told NPR this summer that if the occupation of Afghanistan were scaled back, he really, really hoped we could have a major occupation in Libya. But there's apparently another reason why armed U.S. citizens and their foreign workers are still in Afghanistan, and it's not to keep us safe. The 2006 U.S. National Intelligence Estimate, among other studies, made clear that these wars make us less safe, not more. Almost 4 years ago, at a conference in this town on al-Qaeda, former State Department Coordinator for Counterterrorism Daniel Benjamin listed ways in which we could reduce the threat of terrorism. And afterwards, journalist Gareth Porter asked him whether ending these wars in Afghanistan and Iraq shouldn't have been on his list. "You're right," he answered, "but we can't do that." "Why not?" Porter asked. "Because," he said, "we would have to tell the families of the soldiers who have died in those wars that their loved ones died in vain." Since which comment, of course, many more have died in vain. This is what it comes to, and why nonviolent occupations of our own back in their homeland are required. Our government has gone insane. It is killing people purely because it has already killed people. War was banned by the nations of the world in 1928 and by an 85-1 vote in the U.S. Senate in January 1929, following a decade of work by a peace movement that refused to give up. And now we accept war as part of the air we breathe. In 2008, we may not have voted in 4 more years, but we did vote in 4 more wars: Pakistan, Yemen, Somalia, and Libya, added to Iraq and Afghanistan, and many smaller ones, with routine murders of particular human beings and those standing too close to them, now openly inclusive of U.S. citizens. To a growing extent, we see through this, just as we see through austerity and environmental destruction and corporate welfare and political corruption. But merely waiting for another money-soaked, gerrymandered, cable TV-controlled election on unverifiable voting machines is not going to be sufficient. We're not against elections. This is not either or. We're not against elections. We're demanding reforms that might make meaningful elections possible. But trying to redirect the energy of Occupy Wall Street into elections, as was done to Wisconsin, would be an act of betrayal. Derek told you about some of the forces impinging on the supercons. Super Congress member John Kerry's home state is 5th in the nation in military spending, employing lots of registered voters building machines of death for Raytheon, the former head of which company was brought in by the Obama administration as Deputy Secretary of Defense, and who told the Washington Times in June, quote, "The wars of the future will be longer, deadlier, and waged against a more diverse variety of enemies than ever before," end quote. Super Congress co-chair Patty Murray, Democrat from Boeing, since 2007 has taken $276,000 from the war industries. Max Baucus, $139,000, Dave Camp, $130,000, John Kerry, $73,000, and so on. The president, who must sign or veto whatever comes out of the Super Congress and the less than Super Congress, took over $1 million from the war industries just in the 2008 election, not to mention $39 million from finance, insurance, and real estate. Targeting our social safety net is a goal that Wall Street and the military-industrial complex have shared for many years. And of course, the general corporate exploitation of foreign resources and workers depends on the threat of military force. Military spending has increased at the president's request each year since 2008, as well as since 2001. Thanks to Occupy Wall Street, a conversation has been launched about the damage that the wealthiest 1% is doing to the rest of us. California just pulled out of a mortgage fraud settlement deal that is expected to let the crooks off easy. Who's to say Occupy Wall Street did not influence that decision? The super congressional crusade to slash spending can only be carried through without causing massive misery and death in one of two ways, neither of which the U.S. Congress or President wants to touch, but both of which are central demands of this occupation movement. The first is to significantly raise taxes on the super wealthy. The second is to significantly cut spending on the military. A progressive demand right now is not jobs, not cuts. It is jobs, not wars. Every gun that's made, said Dwight David Eisenhower, every warship launched, every rocket fired signifies a theft from those who hunger and are not fed, those who are cold and are not clothed. It also signifies death and injury to those on the receiving end, almost all of whom are non-Americans. But we cannot have a movement in this country demanding funding for anything decent or humane without having a movement to restrain the machine that, as you've just seen, is sucking down over 63% of discretionary spending, serving as our biggest polluter of the natural environment and providing the leading justification for eroding our civil liberties. So these are the demands we will bring to Freedom Plaza beginning Thursday. Tax the rich and corporations. End the wars, bring the troops home, cut military spending. Protect the social safety net, strengthen Social Security, and improved Medicare for all. End corporate welfare for oil companies and other big business interests. Transition to a clean energy economy. Reverse environmental degradation. Protect worker rights, including collective bargaining. Create jobs and raise wages, and get the money out of politics. Now, there is a widespread belief that such a list of demands must be reduced to one bumper sticker. But is what I just read really too many words for people who pass 10,000-word laws meant to govern us? There are hundreds of times as many words as I just read in the instruction booklet for a Blu-ray player, something your average American seems able to handle. Nobody told Thomas Jefferson the Declaration of Independence had to fit into an 8-second soundbite. We are not going to win this by getting pithier. And let me let you in on a little secret. Corporate television doesn't dislike resistance to corporate power because its advocates are unskilled at framing and messaging. We are not going to win this by kicking ourselves. We aren't going to win this by dividing ourselves. We need to be willing to stand in uncomfortably large coalitions, side by side, with people who like different parties or candidates or who hold what we think are bizarre views of the world. In Freedom Plaza, there will be no promotion of any party or any candidate. We will be speaking as we the people, to them our government. And we will have a lot more fun than can be had by sitting home and griping or even engaging in all variety of other useful activities, from phone calling to emailing to tweeting to sitting in conferences and listening to me. I mean way more fun. The kind of fun in solidarity with others that medical science says is good for our health. The kind of fun that can take young people buried in student debt and joblessness away from enormous signing bonuses offered by the war machine. Young people will be reached in Freedom Plaza through seminars, libraries, outdoor films, and the experience of democratic decision-making and risk-taking. And the price is right. Compared with $259 per night here in the Hilton, the accommodations in Freedom Plaza will be priceless. Power concedes nothing without a demand, said Frederick Douglass. It never did, and it never will.